Section 1. The spark of an idea. A new nation. Imagined. It all began with a question. Whispered at first, then spoken, then shouted. How did a scattered collection of colonies, clinging to the edge of a vast and unknown continent, dare to dream of becoming a nation? This was not just a story of land and resources, but of an idea, a powerful and dangerous idea. People had crossed a great ocean, leaving behind old worlds and old ways. They sought opportunity. They sought freedom from kings. They sought freedom from bishops. They began to see themselves not as transplanted Englishmen, not as transplanted Germans, but as something new, something American. Carving out lives in a rugged land, that work was changing them from the inside out. The British Crown, an ocean away, saw the colonies as a source of wealth, a cog in its imperial machine. It levied taxes to pay for its wars and its administration. A tax on paper, a tax on glass, a tax on tea. To the colonists, these were not just economic burdens, they were insults. No taxation without representation. The first shots were fired on a village green in Lexington, Massachusetts. But what kind of nation would emerge from the blood and sacrifice of revolution? Section 2. Forging a republic. Trials, triumphs, and a terrible compromise. Winning the war was one thing. Building a nation was another challenge entirely. The young United States was not yet united. Leaders like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. They gathered in Philadelphia during a hot summer, not to amend the old rules, but to create something entirely new. A constitution. It established three co-equal branches, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, to create a system of checks and balances. Yet a shadow lingered over this grand project. To secure the agreement of the southern states, the framers made a terrible compromise. The Constitution did not abolish slavery. It counted an enslaved person as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of political representation. This was the great contradiction at the heart of the American experiment. The nation began to grow, pushing westward Lewis and Clark's epic journey to the Pacific. This westward expansion was seen as America's manifest destiny. But the land was not empty. It was the ancestral home of hundreds of Native American nations. The story of expansion became a story of displacement, of broken treaties. The country was getting bigger and richer, but its founding contradictions were growing deeper. Was it a land of freedom for all, or just for some? Section 3. A nation divided. The uncivil war and a second founding. The question of slavery could not be postponed forever. With every new state added to the Union, the debate raged anew. Would it be free or slave? The nation's economy and culture had split into two distinct paths. The North was industrializing. Factories, railroads, immigrant labor. The South remained agrarian, built entirely upon the brutal institution of slave labor. These were not just different regions, becoming different civilizations. Books like Uncle Tom's Cabin revealed the human horror of slavery. The political compromises that had held the nation together began to crumble. Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska Act. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was the final breaking point. For the southern states, this was an existential threat. One by one, they seceded from the Union. The war that followed was a tragedy of unimaginable scale. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Antietam, Gettysburg, Vicksburg. But with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, it transformed into a struggle for human freedom. For the first time, Black Americans, free and formerly enslaved, were allowed to enlist in the Union Army, fighting for their own liberation. After 4 long and bloody years, the Union was preserved. The nation had been saved. But would it truly be remade? Section 4. The Age of Steel and Steam. An industrial giant awakens. In the ashes of the Civil War, a new America was forged, not in the halls of government, but in the fires of the furnace and the thunder of the factory. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel, pouring from mills in Pittsburgh, built skeletons for skyscrapers that scraped the sky in New York and Chicago. Oil, pumped from the ground in Pennsylvania and Texas. America was transforming from a rural agricultural society This incredible growth created new titans of industry, men with names like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt. They built vast corporate empires. Their fortunes were staggering, funding universities, libraries, and concert halls. But this glittering prosperity had a dark underside. For millions of workers, life was a desperate struggle. They worked 12-hour days in dangerous factories for meager wages, living in crowded, unsanitary tenements. Workers constructing a skyscraper perched precariously on steel beams. From this struggle, a new force emerged, the labor movement, demanding better pay, safer conditions, and an 8-hour day. Millions of immigrants poured in from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States was no longer just a nation. It was an industrial giant. For most of its history, America had followed the advice of its first president, George Washington, to avoid foreign entanglements. It was a nation protected by two vast oceans, but by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this isolation was becoming impossible to maintain. The world was shrinking. America's booming factories needed overseas markets for their goods and sources for their raw materials. A new sense of confidence, and some said arrogance, began to take hold. The Spanish-American War in 1898 was a turning point. A short, decisive conflict, it left the United States in control of former Spanish colonies, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. Suddenly, America had an overseas empire. This sparked a fierce debate. President Theodore Roosevelt embodied this new, assertive spirit. He sent the Great White Fleet of new American battleships on a tour around the world. Roosevelt's motto was "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He also engineered the construction of the Panama Canal, connecting the Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean. The canal was a powerful symbol of America's growing influence. When a great war erupted in Europe in 1914, America's first instinct was to stay out. President Woodrow Wilson won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But the realities of modern warfare and global economics made neutrality difficult. In 1917, the United States entered World War I. The arrival of fresh American troops helped tip the balance. But could this military victory be translated into a lasting peace? Section 6. The crucible of crisis, depression, war, and the rise of a Titan America emerged from World War I as a major creditor nation. The 1920s roared with jazz music, flapper dresses, a soaring stock market. In October 1929, the bubble burst. The stock market crashed, and the nation spiraled into the Great Depression. Banks failed, factories closed, millions of Americans were thrown out of work. Dorothea Lange's migrant mother became an iconic symbol. In this moment of profound crisis, the country turned to a new leader, Franklin D. Roosevelt. His administration launched a whirlwind of programs to provide relief, recovery, and reform. The government put people to work building dams, bridges, and parks. It created Social Security, a safety net for the elderly and unemployed. The New Deal fundamentally changed the relationship between the American people and their government. While America struggled to recover, clouds of war were gathering across the globe. Fascist regimes in Italy, Germany, and Japan were on the march. He declared America must become the arsenal of democracy, supplying the Allies. The debate over intervention ended on December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The sleeping giant was now fully awake. The American war effort was a marvel of mobilization. 16 million Americans served in the armed forces. At home, Rosie the Riveter became the symbol. The nation's industrial might outproduced all of its enemies combined. When the war ended in 1945, America stood alone as the world's undisputed superpower, armed with a terrifying new weapon, the atomic bomb. Section 7. The Long Twilight Struggle. A Cold War and a divided globe victory in World War II did not bring lasting peace. Instead, it gave way to a new kind of global conflict, the Cold War. Allies in the war against fascism now stood as two superpowers. America championed democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union championed communism and a state-controlled economy. Europe was divided by an Iron Curtain. The world became a chessboard for influence. Not a hot war between giants, fought through proxy wars, espionage, and arms race. The central doctrine was containment. The US sought to prevent the spread of communism. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe. NATO bound America to Europe's defense. Hot wars followed abroad. Korea, American soldiers fought in the 1950s. Vietnam, American soldiers fought in the 1960s-70s. Competition extended to science and technology, the space race. Sputnik in 1957 shocked America. The nation poured resources into education and research. 1969, one small step on the moon. The Cold War fueled a nuclear arms race. Both sides built vast arsenals. Mutual assured destruction created a fragile peace. At home, the Cold War left a mark. The Red Scare of the 1950s created anti-communist paranoia. It also drove innovation, the early internet and materials science. Inside America, another struggle unfolded. The civil rights movement exposed hypocrisy at home. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. forced change. Landmark legislation dismantled legal segregation. Section 8. The American Century. Redefining Power in a Digital Age. The Cold War came to a sudden and stunning end with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The United States was left as the world's sole superpower. Some called it the end of history, a moment when liberal democracy and free market capitalism had triumphed. The nation led a broad international coalition to repel Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The economy, meanwhile, was being reshaped by a new revolution. This was the dawn of the digital age. The personal computer, once a hobbyist's toy, became a fixture. The Internet, a creation of Cold War military research, blossomed into a global network. Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, Silicon Valley became the world's epicenter of innovation. This technological dominance was a new form of power. American culture became a dominant global force. Hollywood movies, rock and roll, hip-hop music, Coca-Cola, McDonald's. For many, America represented freedom, opportunity, and modernity. But for others, this cultural dominance was seen as a form of imperialism. The power of the United States was no longer just about its military or its economy. This era of unipolar dominance was shattered on a clear September morning in 2001. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 were a profound shock. The attacks plunged the nation into a new kind of conflict, the war on terror. The 21st century would present a new set of challenges. Section 9. The Ongoing Experiment. Challenges and Choices for a Modern Superpower. The 21st century has tested the United States in ways few could have predicted. The long wars in the Middle East drained resources and political will. The financial crisis of 2008 triggered a Great Recession. The rise of China as a near-peer competitor, both economically and militarily, signaled the end of the unipolar moment. The world was no longer a chessboard with a single dominant player, but a complex multipolar arena with many centers of power and influence. America's position as the undisputed leader was no longer guaranteed. New challenges have emerged that respect no borders. Climate change threatens coastal cities and agricultural heartlands. Global pandemics, like the one that swept the world in 2020, the digital revolution, which once seemed so full of promise, has also revealed a darker side. The spread of misinformation, the erosion of privacy, the vulnerability of critical infrastructure to cyber attacks. These are global problems that require global cooperation, challenging a superpower that has often preferred to act alone. Internally, the nation continues to grapple with its oldest and most difficult questions. Debates over immigration, race, and identity have become more polarized. The decline of manufacturing in some regions has created economic anxiety. The promise of the American dream feels more distant for many. The nation finds itself in a period of intense self-reflection. The story of how the United States became a superpower is not a simple triumphal march. It is a complex and often contradictory tale. The American experiment is, and always has been, a work in progress. The story is still being written, and its next chapter depends on the choices we make today.